Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at Northern Kentucky University. Our center is the host for tonight's 6 at 6 lecture. This season, we have been coming to you live from the Southgate Street School in Newport, but because of the snow, those of you who are not in the Northern Kentucky, Cincinnati area may not know this, but we have ice and snow on the ground in some places as much as 12 inches. And we're not a Western state used to 12 inches or Erie, New York, or Pennsylvania, or any of those places. So I know my neighbors had, a couple of my neighbors had snow blowers. I didn't, so I now have snow blower envy. So we are with you from our various homes, and happy to be with you this evening. This series this year, we have tried to focus on the Black history and culture, and we have hosted at the Southgate Street Museum for a very specific reason, and that is that this was a school in Newport for Black children from immediately after the Civil War until right after the Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s, when schools were desegregated. What you see right here is a mural that's on the flood wall in Newport, the first of 9 murals that will be there, painted by NKU students and designed in an NKU art class. It's part of what our connection to the museum is all about, in addition to helping the museum to come into existence. It has become a place where our students can learn by doing. And so we've had 15 or 20 classes so far, all variety of classes, some business classes that worked on a business plan, and public relations class that worked on a strategy for that. And history classes that have helped design the exhibits. Here you see some students from a public history class inside the museum working on the exhibits, which are now up. And once we're through the pandemic, I hope you can come by and see the museum. This lecture series, which is we've had for a little over a decade, is designed to celebrate scholarship and research and creative activity by NKU faculty and students. And we have been able to do that in the various venues in the community. In a normal year, we would be at the Baker Hunt in Covington, the Carnegie Center in Covington, the Mercantile Library in downtown Cincinnati, the Behringer Crawford Museum, and the Campbell County Library, all of whom are our partners. But we did commit this year to being at the Southgate Street School in a special effort to elevate this topic in our community and to introduce this museum to the community. We have some sponsors this year that I'd like to thank for being with us. Thomas More University is a partner this year, as is the Holocaust and History Center, which is at the Museum Center in Cincinnati, and the Friends of Music Hall, and the Behringer Crawford Museum's History Hour, which will be tomorrow night. It's every Wednesday night, Zoom on local history. So consider joining that. And the Northern Kentucky Forum, which is essentially a town hall for Northern Kentucky to discuss public affairs. We're working on some programming upcoming on the Brent Spence Bridge and other topics, so watch that. So we're happy to have all of these partners. I want to give a couple of minutes to Scott Clark, who is the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Newport, to tell you just a little more about the Southgate Street School, which is now a museum and really an important landmark in our community. Scott?
Thank you, Mark. And thank you all for tuning in. Tonight's topic is quite relevant to the Southgate Street School. This school was, as Mark talked about, was started.
But we need you to unmute, I think.
Oh,
you're good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. So this school was started shortly after the Civil War. A matter of fact, the same year that the black man got the vote, that the city of Newport decided they needed a school to educate black children. The present building, the building you saw just in the slide earlier, was built in 1893, built as part of the segregated school system, and it serviced not only Newport, but all of Campbell County for 80 years until it desegregated in 1955, right after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. What's incredibly important about this school is not only the fact that it was designed, it was built, it was here to educate the black children, but in many ways, it actually flew against the face of conventional wisdom in Kentucky, which wanted to severely segregate the schools and severely curtail the type of education that was happening with black children. This particular school, the Southgate Street School, actually enriched their children beyond measure. In this particular case, separate but equal was actually not equal. They actually received a superior education at this school. And most of all, they received hope, and they received the ability to be able to think beyond the walls and be able to reach for whatever it was they wanted to do with their lives. These students were enriched. They were told that you may come from domestics. Your people may have worked in the steel mill or cleaned somebody else's house or worked as a domestic, but you can do more. You can go on to college. You can see the world. You can join the military. You can be the person that you want to be. And the curriculum and the education that was given to these students allowed them to just see that. So I'm very excited about our topic tonight as far as how the national focus looked. We're also very proud of our museum, the fact that the Prince Hall Masons, Newport Lodge 120, has owned the building since 1959 and has allowed us to not only preserve the building, but to preserve the story and the histories and the excitement that went on in this school for future generations and continue to tell it. So once the COVID restrictions are lifted, we welcome you to our museum to see us on Southgate Street, the only building on Southgate Street between Saratoga and Washington, and also to join us on Facebook as we provide new content. In the spring, we will have a new exhibit sponsored by the public history program at Northern Kentucky University, the collections class that will have a new exhibit on the 225-year history of the city of Newport. So thank you for this forum. Thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to this topic, and many thanks to Mark Nykirk and the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement for including us and also being the inspiration that helped us be able to get this museum off the ground.
Thank you, Scott. You're most welcome. It's a mutual partnership. Our students get a lot of learning opportunities by the partnership with Newport, the museum, and some other projects in the city. So we're appreciative of all that. I want to get on with the introduction of our speaker tonight, Steve Luxenberg. This is Steve's book, and the journey to tonight began at the Kentucky Book Fair in 2019, where Steve had a table. If you haven't been to the book fair, again, as we say so often, after COVID, hope you can get to the book fair. It's an extraordinary event. I went to it probably 30 years ago when it was in a hallway at Kentucky State in Frankfort. It is now occupies a huge room at the Kentucky Horse Park and is a celebration of literature, beginning with children's literature and all manner of fiction, nonfiction, and authors who give talks during the day and so forth. So I hope we're all back together at the book fair, but I saw Steve and his book, which I was interested in, and said, gee, it'd be great if you would come to Newport in the future and talk about the book and the scholarship that led to it. And he said yes, and I'm sorry we couldn't fly him here and feed him and let him see our community. I think he has particular interest in seeing and visiting the Freedom Center. So maybe that will happen one day, but Steve, it's great to have you tonight. Steve is an associate editor at the Washington Post, so he's got a pretty busy day job, probably a night job at times too, writing and editing and directing projects. One project that he directed last year was the sort of quick publication of an inside look at the first impeachment of President Trump. I believe the team is working on a revision of that book with some additional information behind the scenes about the current impeachment. He has, but separate is a book of history and the story of the defining case in the separate but equal doctrine. And I urge you to, if you get it from the library, get it, purchase it and read it. He'll talk about that book a little bit tonight, as well as some of his journalistic inquiries into race in America. And we'll hear a lot about John Marshall Harlan, the great justice from Kentucky, known as the lone dissenter. We'll have time for questions at the end. You'll see a Q&A function on your screen. Please type your questions into there. I will monitor those, and when Steve is through with his talk, I'll moderate those questions. So just put your questions in there and I'll keep track of them. Steve, welcome to Kentucky as much as we can make it so. And here we go.
Here I go. I hope that the internet connection by Airbnb outside of Washington doesn't cause any problems, but it was being a little bit finicky before. So bear with me. Thanks, Mark, for that introduction. This is going to be a fun evening, I hope. Lots of questions. I've been to Kentucky a number of times in both researching separate, looking into the life of John Marshall Harlan, but also to talk about the book. And Kentucky audiences are quite something. They are full of questions, full of energy. Don't disappoint me tonight. Even though we're on Zoom, I want to see that chat function light up. Should I apologize for my northern accent? I guess in a story about the North and the South, which partly this is, I don't have any reason to apologize. So one of the things left out of my bio, I also have a television credit. I had a bit part on one episode of season 5 of the HBO show The Wire, in which I was playing a newspaper. So I guess that I'm back. I apologize for that. I hope it doesn't happen again. The better story about my television career is I got a a letter from a lawyer asking me to sign the rights to use my name. And I noticed that the letter said that I was giving them the rights to use my name anywhere in the universe. So being the puckish guy that I am, I inserted the word known, K-N-O-W-N, and sent it off with my signature. Well, a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from HBO's lawyer showing that they have a lot to do up there in New York, asking me why I had modified the agreement. And I said, well, I feel perfectly comfortable giving you the rights to the known universe, but the unknown universe is still mine. Fortunately, he did not require me to sign the letter again. Now, before we get started, I really want to give a big thank you and shout out to Mark and Northern Kentucky University, the Scripps Center, to Southgate Street Museum, and all of the people behind the scenes, Felicia Scher and Chris Strobel, who make this possible. And it is a lot of work. And I think that the audience should know that there are people working diligently to try to bring you this kind of an event. Now, tonight's talk is going to have 4 elements. 2 intersect with the title of the series, which is History and Culture of Race in America. I want to make some observations about how we talk about history and how we talk about race. Then I'm going to dive into the extraordinary story behind the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and with an emphasis on the justice from Northern Kentucky, that Mark mentioned, John Marshall Harlan, who was born in Frankfurt and named to the Supreme Court at the age of 41 in 1877. Now, Harlan's journey from slaveholder's son and pro-slavery candidate for Congress at the age of 26 to renouncing his views of slavery and then becoming the most famous dissenter in the Supreme Court's history through his dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, earning him the title in some circles of the great dissenter. This is a journey, I think, that is a remarkable one and that might give us some thought-provoking ideas about how our divisions today might be changed or healed. I think that Harlan's evolution shows that people are not stuck in their ways, and that if we think about his journey, we might learn something for ourselves. I'm hoping to provoke questions with my comments and thoughts. At this moment in our racial history, we're having a conversation that we should not be silent about. So please join in. Now, recently, I gave a talk to a group of US senators, and I was warned before the talk that it was likely that one of these senators would stand up and interrupt me to ask a question. And I said, I knew how to handle such a senator. I would say, I yield to the esteemed senator from Kentucky. So I yield to anyone who has a question. Let's have a lively debate in the last 45 minutes. One of the ways of writing about history that came clear to me in doing this story is the idea of let me put it this way. You can write about history as the seed theory, or you can write about it as the evolutionary theory. So the seed theory goes something like this. We know the outcome of an action. We know that in this case, Justice Harlan dissents in the Plessy case. What are the seeds of his thinking? Let's go back to his childhood, his young adulthood. Let's sift through his biography and find out where these ideas came from. I think the seed theory is a mistake most of the time. We often can't find the seeds that we're looking for. Instead, I prefer the evolutionary theory, which is that events, experiences cause people to rethink and change sometimes. And that I prefer the idea of history as an evolution rather than as writing about it as a plumbing through the past looking for the idea. Now, I'll tell you a good example of this. Early in the research about Harlan after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, which overturned essentially Plessy, there was a lot of interest in Harlan because of his dissent in the Plessy case, which was in 1896. Some historian unearthed some papers and attributed to Harlan an essay when he was 15 years old about liberty. Many, many years later, with the benefit of the internet, which that historian did not have, I was rereading this essay, and it struck me that it was not the language of a 15-year-old. So I took some of the key phrases, some of the memorable, the unique phrases, and I put them into Google. And within 3 minutes, I had shown myself that Harlan did not write this essay. It was something he had, I later learned, he had copied, not plagiarized, but copied because he liked the essay apparently, that had been published in 1825, 11 years before his birth. Wait a minute, I think I might have his date, 7 years before his birth. So all the thinking that had gone into the idea that Harlan had shown his regard for liberty as early as 15, which he might have, but this essay was not an example of that. So I prefer, as I said, the evolutionary theory. And I'm going to show you the evolution, the journey that Harlan took from being a young man and a pro-slavery guy to the man he was on the Supreme Court. Now, the caveat here, I am not a constitutional law scholar and I'm not a legal historian. I did major in history in college and I'm a good historian of the non-academic type, but I'm primarily a storyteller. And I look for the elements of a good story and I like to tell it in a narrative way, and that's how Separate is written. A little bit about the book. There are 4 major characters. There are the 2 justices, the majority writer and the minority writer, that's Harlan. There is the lawyer for Plessy, a man by the name of Albion Turget. And there is the leader of the New Orleans group that brings the case. It's not a lawsuit, but brings the case in the early 1890s that is later decided by the Supreme Court. Excuse me, I'm going to rub my nose here. His name is Louis Martinet, and like the other members of his committee in New Orleans who bring this test case, he is of a mixed race background, which is typical for many of the people in New Orleans in that period and still today. This is going back to the French and Spanish roots of New Orleans. And these are people, many of whom involved in the case, in the Plessy case, had never been enslaved. Their parents had never been enslaved. Plessy, for example, you have to go back to his great-grandmother on his mother's side to find anyone who was enslaved. And she was freed long before the Americans took over New Orleans. She was freed in 1779. So Plessy and his family grew up free. They were called the Free People of Color. There was a great deal of a mixed relationship, producing many people of mixed race. And it is that group which has some wealth, some education, and some clout in the community that is unhappy with this new law in New Orleans in 1890 called the Separate Car Act, car referring to a railroad, Separate Car Act, which requires, mandates the separation of the races on railroad trains operating within Louisiana. Not only does it mandate it, but it does something that no law at the time had done, which is that it criminalized the behavior of the passengers. If you sat in the wrong car, you could be charged with a crime. And that is the way in which the lawyers for Plessy wanted to attack the case. They wanted to show the Supreme Court, if they got there, not a guarantee by any means, that they were, that this idea of a criminal charge without due process, where it starts with the conductor who's doing the separation, who's not taking any testimony, he doesn't have any evidence about anybody's race, there's no definition for race in the law, this is the way they're going to attack it. In order to do that, they had to bring a test case, but they can't bring a lawsuit. They got to get somebody arrested so that they are charged with that crime, and that's the way that the law will come into effect. So that's a little bit about the case. Now, we know this case today as the, quote, separate but equal case. I say it's synonymous with the separate but equal case. But you might be surprised to learn that the words separate but equal do not appear in the majority decision. Often today, there is a reference to the Plessy case as creating a doctrine of the separate but equal. If you read the case, if you read the ruling, you will find no such doctrine. That is an interpretation that is created over the years following the Plessy case. Now, you might think, Steve, you're kind of parsing words here. It endorsed the idea of separate but equal by allowing Louisiana to enact a law separating the passengers. Why are you quarreling over these words? Well, the reason is because I think we put too much emphasis on the actions of those justices in the case. It was a 7-1 case. One justice did not participate. It is not, in my view, it is not proper to lay all of the blame at the feet of those 8 Supreme Court justices. The blame belongs with all of us who were alive in the 19th century. Well, of course, we're not alive, but our predecessors who accepted the custom of separation going back to the North before the Civil War on a railroad train in Massachusetts. The first passenger train operated by the Eastern Railroad in 1838 had separate cars for its passengers. Now, there were 8 Massachusetts railroads operating at the time. Only 3 of them separated their passengers, but that's where the birthplace of separation on passenger railroads takes place, in the North and not in the South. Now, we're all together here virtually in Northern Kentucky, and it's important to the story because the Ohio River, which separated the North from the South, was an important aspect of life for John Harlan. When he was a young man, his sister had moved to Evansville, Indiana, across the river, and he would take the steamboat, perhaps a little bit of a train to get to the steamboat, travel down the river, and see his sister in Evansville, and that is where he met his wife-to-be, Malvina Shanklin, in 1854. That's a little bit about the start of Harlan's story. Now, when you research Plessy, one of the things, I'm going to share a screen here, have a little fun. You go onto the internet and you look for a photo of Mr. Plessy, who was a shoemaker in his late 20s when he volunteered to get arrested. You will find this photo, and it will be clearly identified as Homer Plessy. Now, Homer Plessy is a walk-on in this story. Once his volunteering is over, the lawyers take over, and it's not the end of Mr. Plessy's involvement, but it is pretty much, he's not involved in the legal strategy. All right, I will tell you one thing about what we know about Mr. Homer Plessy is that this is not Homer Plessy. If you do a Google search and you type in Homer Plessy photo, this is the page you will come up with. This is a screenshot from the internet. And as you'll see, there are many examples of this man. The other ones are also not Homer Plessy. You'll see below the red circle, that's John Marshall Harlan, the justice. So what's going on here? Well, there's an entry right at the bottom of the screen there. I'm going to blow it up for you. No, internet, this is not Homer Plessy, but who is it? For all of you out there who think that the internet is error-free, here's a good example of where you can be misled. I know that nobody out there thinks that the internet is gospel. Well, somebody sometime identified Homer Plessy as this man who is PBS Pinchback, another mixed race. He was a Mississippian who moved to Louisiana, became governor for a very short time in the crazy Louisiana politics. And somebody confused it, and it lasts forever. You can't get rid of it. So let's move on to John Marshall Harlan. I mentioned this is Malvina Shanklin and John on their wedding day, December 23rd, 1856 in Evansville, Indiana. Her family warned her about marrying a Southerner who was a slaveholder's son. Her uncle told her, she wrote in her memoir later, that if she married John, that he was going to stop having anything to do with her because he was an abolitionist. And yet when Malvina arrived in Frankfurt to join the Harland, one of her wedding gifts was a maid who was enslaved. A big shock for the young girl who called herself Mally. That was her name. Here is Harlan 5 years later in his Union uniform, he raised his own regiment. Now, it wasn't a given that Harlan would fight for the Union. This was a guy who in 1856, when he began to be involved in politics at the tender age of 22, and then later when he ran for Congress in 1859, ran as a pro-slavery candidate and spoke about slavery in a positive way. But he also believed strongly that the Union had to be preserved. So when he joined the Union Army and raised his own regiment, he wrote a letter to the Louisville Courier-Journal in which he said that he was going to fight to preserve the Union, and if it became a war for slavery, a war to end slavery, then he was going to be out. Now, he did leave the Army in 1863 because of the death of his father, but that was because his father had left behind an estate that was in debt, and Harlan, as the main male head of the family, felt that he had to go home to help the family escape from that indebtedness. Here was one of the results. You'll see in the circle that I'm about to put up that the administrators had to sue the heirs, that is, they were essentially suing themselves, for a public sale of some of the Harlan's enslaved household. They had about 9 slaves at that point, because they didn't have the cash to pay off their debts. And one of the only ways to raise the money was to offer their enslaved household, some of the members, for sale. Now, to show that they really did care about their slaves, the Harlans bought back about 7 of the 9 slaves. But this was a man who was thoroughly involved in slavery, making his journey all the more remarkable. This is from the Harlan Estate Papers. The yellow highlighted, I put it down there at the screen, saying what they needed to do. The war ends, and there are 3 extremely important constitutional amendments added that make it, in some people's minds, in my mind and other historians, almost a new constitution. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment establishes due process and equal protection, as well as granting citizenship rights for the recently freed, liberated, enslaved population. And then the 15th Amendment in 1870 establishes voting rights. It was interpreted for Black men, even though it didn't mention men or women, continuing the practice of having voting rights only for men. Wasn't corrected until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed and women's suffrage was recognized. Harlan opposed these 3 amendments when they were passed by the legislatures, the new legislatures of the recently readmitted states. Why? Because he argued that it was a local concern. It was not a federal concern. This is a very important part of Harlan's journey. He wrote a letter in 1865 to a Lexington newspaper reacting to the 13th Amendment. And what he says, you can read it on the screen. I have highlighted in red those words: our undoubted right, our referring to Kentucky, to regulate our own local concerns. Over the next 5 years, he joins the Republican Party in 1868, which in Kentucky is like signing your own political death warrant in 1868, because the Republican Party was weak. But he couldn't stand the Democrats. He couldn't stand those people he had fought against in the Civil War, who were the Confederates. And so he joins the Republican Party. And by 1873, he understands and recognizes that the issue of white supremacy, the issue of equal rights, protection for the enslaved population will never cease to be an issue unless the federal government is concerned, is involved. Now in the North, let's not leave the North off the hook. It's not all peaches and cream for people who are recently, for people of color. In the Detroit Free Press, from my home state of Michigan, here's the headline that appeared after the state had narrowly rejected a state constitutional amendment that would have established voting rights for its Black citizens before the federal 15th Amendment. I'm going to circle the key headline there. Michigan believes this is a white man's government. So the North is still having problems of its own. I want to fast forward a bit here to 1883. On the way, I'm going to tell you a little bit about John Harlan's journey to the Supreme Court. So he wasn't always aiming for the Supreme Court. Harlan was a politician more than anything else. He ran for governor twice as a Republican in 1871 and 1875, and that's when he renounced his pro-slavery views. He tells a story about the man that you see on the screen, Frederick Douglass. The story is a kind of remarkable one. Harlan tells it some years later when he's writing a letter to his son. I'm going to read to you just a portion of it in separate because it's so remarkable. So Harlan is campaigning 1870. As I write, another town, another courthouse, another curious crowd. And as he's entering the courthouse, somebody stops him and says, General Harlan, you should be careful tonight. There's a mischief maker who is plotting to ask you an ugly question. Well, sure enough, somebody stood up and said, General Harlan, it is rumored among the people here that you sat beside a Negro at dinner in Maine a few years ago. How is that? A Negro at a dinner table in Maine. Now, John knew this crowd, mostly Democrats, and he knew that they shared the man's presumptions and prejudice. But he also sensed the discomfort in the room with the question because Kentucky gentlemen didn't do this sort of thing. So in answering, he decided he would appeal to the gentlemanly instincts of the crowd, not to their fears. He would not deny or dodge or disguise his views. There was a risk, but he decided to shoulder it. Here's what he said. I am taken aback, he said genially, by the great issue now unexpectedly thrown at me. It seems that the contest for Kentucky's highest office depends on whether I ate dinner with a Negro in Maine. Well, here are the facts. He had been invited to Maine by the Speaker of the House at the time, James Blaine. He was stumping for General Grant in his re-election in 1872, and Blaine had invited Douglas to join the traveling troupe. Blaine had invited the entire troop to dinner. John arrived to find himself seated next to Douglas. Now, Douglas at this point needed no introduction to anyone in America. He was perhaps the most famous Black man in the country. So here's what he told the crowd, what Harlan told the crowd in 1875. He asked them this question. Would you, Kentuckians, have expected me to rise from my seat and lecture Mr. Blaine at his own table? Would you have expected me to leave the house? Well, no, I ate my dinner in entire comfort, eating neither more or less because of Douglas' presence near me. Well, he earned the appreciative laughs from the crowd that he had been expecting. But he did not leave the story there because that's not where he wanted to end it. He said, I not only ate by Douglas's side at Blaine's house, but during the campaign, I sat at the same table with him in public hotels and spoke from the same platform as him. And here let me say that there is no man of any party in Kentucky who can make an abler address before a public audience than can Frederick Douglass. I not only do not apologize for what I said, but frankly say I would rather eat dinner any day at the side of Mr. Douglass than to eat with the fellow across the way who sought to entrap me with a question that has nothing to do with the race for the governorship. And in John's memory, the applause was loud and long. Maybe the years made that memory a little bit sharper. Well, Douglas came to Louisville in 1883. There was a national convention of colored men. He gave a speech to that convention. In the crowd was a man from New Orleans, a man named Louis Martinet, who would later go on to be the engine behind the committee that would bring the Plessy case. Here's the headlines from the Louisville Courier-Journal. Quoting Douglas as saying, Louisville, Metropolitan in size, cosmopolitan in ideas, is still not free and liberal enough. Here's what Douglas told the crowd, among other things. He was trying to make them understand about the color line. This was a key moment, 1883, because it is the same year as the civil rights cases. That is what it is called at the Supreme Court. 5 cases combined together that were a challenge to the 1875 Civil Rights Act. The 1875 Civil Rights Act. That is a full 90 years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that act did much the same thing. It ensured fairness on public accommodations of all sorts. It was a federal law. In 1883, the Supreme Court overturned that law as an overreach by Congress with the dissent of John Harlan. Now, this was his first dissent. And here's what John Harlan wrote. I'm going to say as you read this, that Harlan cared more about his dissent. Up until that point, he'd been on the court for 6 years. He cared more about his dissent in the civil rights cases than any other case that he had involved in so far. I highlighted these words. He's saying that the national legislature may, without transcending the limits of the Constitution, do for human liberty and the fundamental rights of American citizenship what it did with the sanction of this court for the protection of slavery and the rights of masters of fugitive slaves. That is a reference back to the Dred Scott case of 1857, the infamous case that is spoken about in the same breath as Plessy, in which Roger Taney, the Chief Justice at the time, declared that Blacks were not citizens of the United States, whether free or enslaved, making a comparison to the civil rights cases and Dred Scott. Harlan was. So he's saying here, I had now moved on from the local concerns that I was worried about during the late 1860s and my opposition to those 3 civil rights amendments. I am now saying that we, the court and the national legislature, can do this without transcending the limits of the Constitution. So he's made that leap. There are 3 consistent themes in Harlan's opinions. He felt he was hewing to the Constitution as he saw it. He felt he was recognizing the court's power and also its limits. And he was insistent on equal rights as a matter of law. That is a consistent theme through his civil rights dissents, including Plessy. Now, it is important not to confuse the Supreme Court of the 19th century with the Supreme Court of today. Not only was it comprised of 9 male justices, there were no Sotomayors or Kagans or Ruth Bader Ginsburgs, but it was men of all the same class. They were all men of property, all men of wealth. They were Democrats and they were Republicans, but it was a largely Republican court. Remember, the Republicans are the party of anti-slavery in its founding. But the Supreme Court was not yet deciding as many interesting cases as it did in the 20th century. Why? Well, because these laws were new. The 13th, 14th Amendment, by 1883, those amendments had been in place for only 13 years. And the court had not yet received all of the cases that it would receive in the 20th century. So there are not a lot of Supreme Court cases on civil rights, but the ones that were decided, Harlan was usually the only dissenter. So now we're going to move on to Plessy versus Ferguson, because I really want to get the questions. And as I wrote a 500-page book, I could talk all day about this case. Louis Martinet, in 1890, when the Louisiana legislature passed the law that mandated separation on railroad trains, wrote in the New Orleans Crusader, he was the editor of this Black newspaper, this mixed race newspaper, "We will make a test case and we will bring it before the federal courts." They created a committee. They called themselves the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the separate car law. Clearly, they did not have a good PR firm working for them. That's a mouthful. But you'll see from the letterhead that many of the names are French, which shows you this mixed race background, this French-Spanish mixed race background of this group in New Orleans. Oops. So there's Martinet's name. You'll read some of the others: Antoine, Piron, Chevalier, Augusta, Bonsignor. As I said, the Plessy case is also often misunderstood because of this idea that it created a doctrine of separate but equal, when the court actually decided the case by ruling that Louisiana had, under its police powers to preserve law and order and peace, it had the authority to create such an act as the Separate Car Act. But Justice Brown, this is Justice Brown here, Henry Billings Brown of Massachusetts, a Republican nominee to the court in 1890 from Massachusetts, but by way of Michigan. He went to Michigan as a young man, was elevated to the federal bench, and he spent 15 years on the federal bench before he became a Supreme Court justice in 1890. He went far beyond what he needed to write, and that's why the Plessy decision gets such scrutiny, because of Brown's overreach in some of the things that he said. And one of the things that he said is, in the nature of things, the 14th Amendment could not have been intended to abolish distinction based on color. In the nature of things, I would submit, is not a legal concept. It is a philosophical concept, not a legal concept. Harlan dissented, as we know. He again refers back to the Dred Scott case. In my opinion, he said, this judgment this day rendered will in time prove to be quite as pernicious as Dred Scott. Quite a statement from Mr. Harlan. Now, Harlan went into great length. His dissent was as long as the majority opinion in Plessy. And what he said was the following, essentially: that transportation and the railroads were a public accommodation because so many of the railroads have been granted public charters. They were public roads on public right-of-ways, and it was ridiculous in his view to think of it as a private enterprise which could discriminate because of the private nature of the corporation. As I said to you earlier, separation began on Massachusetts railroad trains. It was a custom then. It was not a law. It was a practice. It came and went. The Massachusetts railroads abandoned the practice by 1843, so it only operated for 5 years, but it was still true in Philadelphia and New York in the 1850s. It wasn't until after the Civil War and the enactment of those 3 amendments that separation began to fade in the North for a time. In New Orleans, there was a famous protest over the segregated streetcars, and from 1868 to pretty late in the 1880s, the streetcars were not segregated. Harlan wrote the following in his dissent in Plessy. Pretty amazing thing for a Supreme Court justice to say. The interests of both races require that the common government of all shall not permit the seeds of race hate to be planted under sanction of law. Think about the journey of a man who once was pro-slavery to write that statement. So I want to end my little talk on Harlan by telling you about his limits, his feeling about limits of the Supreme Court. In 1902, they threw a gala dinner for him to celebrate his 25 years on the court. Everybody was there. President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, was the main speaker. Harlan followed Roosevelt, not an easy task since Roosevelt was quite a stem winder, but Harlan was also, he was legendary in Kentucky for his ability to give an oration. In this happy time with all of his fellows and 300 people at the dinner. Now, to show you the nature of the time, his wife was seated in a balcony. It was only men on the floor of the ballroom. But here's what Harlan told the crowd during this celebratory moment. The power of the Supreme Court for good as well as for evil can scarcely be exaggerated. It can, by its judgments, strengthen our institution, or more easily than any other branch, it can undermine the foundations of our governmental system. So he saw the court as a force for both evil and good, and he was always conscious of that in writing his dissents. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to end by, before we take questions, by telling you a little bit about Plessy afterwards. So as Plessy went forward as a possible precedent, the Supreme Court referred to it more and more during the 20s and 30s. By that time, the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund, Thurgood Marshall, and others recognized that Plessy was more of a problem than the other case that was highly important, which was the civil rights cases. In 1921, Carter Woodson, who was a PhD scholar who had founded the Journal of Negro History, the first of its kind, wrote an essay on the Supreme Court's 50 years of cases since the end of the Civil War. You would think in 1921, when he wrote this essay, that he would have put Plessy at the forefront. But of the 51 pages in the essay, only 2 were spent on Plessy. 12 were spent on the civil rights cases. You can see that in 1921, Plessy was still not regarded as a very important case. It was important, but not the infamous case that we regard it as today. So what made it so important? Well, the Supreme Court itself made it important. When in 1954, in writing about schools, remember Plessy was not about schools, writing about schools, the Supreme Court unanimously 9-0 declared that separate could never be equal and referred to the Plessy case. And while it didn't explicitly state that it was overturning it, essentially said that the Plessy case was being discarded. That's when the Plessy case became as important as we see it today. I thank you for listening. I really welcome your questions. They can also just have observations or comments. Questions are one form of communication, but not the best or the only one. I appreciate everybody being here.
Steve, the first question that we have refers to the Margaret Garner case, which of course is started here in Kentucky with Margaret Garner and the Garner family leaving a plantation in Boone County and going to Cincinnati, and Miss Garner trying to slave children rather than see them return to slavery. The question wonders, did Justice Harlan ever write or comment about a slave person escaping to the north?
You know, Mark, I didn't hear your question clearly. Could you repeat it? You're kind of fuzzy.
My audio is still bad. Maybe. I'll try again. Did Justice Harlan ever write a comment about enslaved persons escaping to the north?
I still got only a portion of it. Can I go into the chat and look at it myself?
Go into the Q&A.
Steve, your volume may be a little high. I think it's feeding back into the Zoom.
Okay, I'm going to turn it down. I put it up to here, Mark.
Let's see if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay now?
You sounded good there, but I'm not sure that Steve heard that. It may have been frozen.
Okay, try again.
Okay, Steve, the question relates to Margaret Garner, who the slave who escaped from Boone County, which is in our area to Cincinnati, and was captured in Cincinnati and attempted to slay her children, including successfully slaying one rather than see them return to slavery.
Morrison, yeah.
Our questioner wonders, did Justice Harlan ever write or comment on slave persons escaping to the North?
You know, I don't think so that I know of. The Fugitive Slave Act is a hugely important part of the 1850s. And he was in favor of the Fugitive Slave Act. So in that way, he did write about it or talk about it. He felt that he was more pro-slavery than his opponent in the 1859 congressional race. So he recognized that the Constitution allowed for slavery. He felt that slavery was the obligation and responsibility of the state of Kentucky. And if the state of Kentucky wanted to abolish it, then that's the way it ought to be abolished. In the Harlan family, the story is told that the Harlans were fully aware of the evils of slavery. But as I say, we know that they not only owned slaves, but they did buy and sell a few in 1863, 64. Remembering that Kentucky, as a member, was not a member of the Confederacy, and therefore the Emancipation Proclamation Act did not apply to Kentucky. So you could own slaves until the end of the war, and the Harlans never manumitted their slaves. But they, what Malvina wrote in her memoir was that her mother-in-law was very much used to having the household help, and they felt they needed to preserve that, sort of dodging the issue of the fact that they were using people who were in bondage.
There are a couple of questions have a connection, and there's, I think, a lot of curiosity in the audience about the evolution of Justice Harlan's thinking. And I'll ask one question directly because I think it gets at it pretty good, and that is, what are your thoughts on why Harlan's moral position on the treatment of people of color evolved to one that appears to be compassionate? Was it morally based or legally based, following the letter of the law?
I think it was both of those things, but also a third thing. It was politically based. Harlan could not be a member of the Republican Party without embracing the Republican Party's stance on slavery. But I also think he had a personal experience. I'm not a fan of the trigger theory, that is, one thing triggers everything else. But he was hired as a temporary prosecutor against the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s after the national legislation of the enforcement acts against the Klan. And he wrote to people and said that he did not think that the Klan could be halted without the federal government's involvement, that the state of Kentucky was not going to be able to do it. And that experience really cemented for him the idea that white supremacy was a big issue. Now, there are many people who point to his words in the Plessy case, in which he says that the white race is the superior one, and he probably will be for all time if it will recognize the rights of people of color. It's justifiable to ask what the heck did he mean by that? Why did he use the word the superior race? But recognizing, of course, that at the time, that's what a lot of white people thought. I think he was playing to those white people and saying, come on, we got to pay attention to equal justice as the law requires. Now, he also was virulently anti-immigrant, something that lasted his entire life. And he writes in Plessy about the Chinese and says, look, a Chinese person can ride on the train with the white people. Why shouldn't people of color be allowed to ride with white people? So I think he was struggling with all these things on all three counts: morally, politically, philosophically. I just think you need to compare him to his peers. 7 justices of the same class did not arrive at the dissent that Harlan did. It cannot have been easy for one man to sit in the room of that conference in 1896 and hold a different position, but Harlan did so. And so that's the journey I think is interesting.
There's really quite a bit of curiosity about this evolution that's appearing in the questions. And one follow-up to that is you mentioned his marriage in Evansville and into a family that was abolitionist by nature, abolitionist family. What do you think his wife's influence was on his thinking? Did that new family connection help shape this evolution?
I think it went both ways. She shaped him, he shaped her. I'll tell one anecdotal story. He was having a hard time writing his dissent in the civil rights cases in 1882. The majority had already decided what they wanted to say. Harlan was having, by Malvina's account, he was having writer's block. So when he had first outfitted there were no offices for the Supreme Court in that era. There was no Supreme Court building. They basically had their offices at home, but the Supreme Court marshal did have supplies for them. And Marshall went to the supply office and he was admiring an inkwell, an inkstand, a double inkstand. And the marshal said to him, "Would you like to have that?" He said, "I should tell you that it was Justice Taney's inkwell when he wrote the Dred Scott decision." Well, Harlan, as a student of history, thought this was marvelous because he agreed with Taney, but because he disagreed with Taney. So he brought it home. And that night, he happened to go to a diplomatic reception and ran into a relative of Taney. He told her the story about retrieving this inkwell, and she said, "Oh, I would love to have my uncle's inkwell." Well, Harlan, being the gentleman, promised it to her. And on the way home in the carriage, he told Malvina about what had happened. Well, Malvina was horrified, the idea that this inkwell would go back to the Taney family. So she did something, I don't know what she was thinking. She's telling the story years later. She hid the inkwell so he couldn't return it. Well, 5 years later, he's writing the dissents, and she unearths the inkwell, places it on his desk, and said, "Perhaps this will help unlock your dissent if you can write it with this ink." She said his pen fairly flew that day. This was a remarkable marriage. They really did support each other and challenge each other. There are letters to Malley, and in return, there's also a remarkable marriage on the other side of the story, on the Plessy side, between the lawyer for Plessy, Albion Turget, who I've given no attention to here, and his wife, Emma. That correspondence, much of it survives. Malley and John, living in the same household, didn't have as much correspondence as the Turgets, who were often apart. But anyway, to answer the question, I think that she was influenced. She had to accept the idea that she was living in a slaveholder's household. He had to accept the idea. She didn't come from an abolitionist family. There was one uncle who was an abolitionist, but they were definitely anti-slavery. There is a distinction, because the abolitionists often wanted it to be immediate. Some wanted it to be gradual. Like all politics in that day, it was complicated too. I can answer more questions about the evolution since I spent a lot of time on it. So don't be wary of another follow-up if you have another angle.
Well, let me move to kind of a different topic so I don't miss this question because we have a attendee asking if beyond the dissents for which Justice Harlan is so known, what are some of the other accomplishments in his life. He mentioned that he had entered politics at a very young age and had had a regiment, but
Well, he did hold several public offices. He returned to his home in Kentucky, in Frankfort in 1863, as I said, to take care of his father's estate, which was a mess. And the estate papers were very complicated to get through. And very few people have ever looked at them, I think. But in 1864, he ran for attorney general, state attorney general. His father had been attorney general earlier, and his father had been U.S. attorney under Lincoln, and had been involved in a clandestine gun running scheme to deliver weapons to Kentucky's Union regiments, which at the time was controversial because they were supposedly independent. Harlan was involved in that as well. But as Kentucky's attorney general after the Civil War, he intervened in cases in which he could oppose those three civil rights amendments, or the two civil rights amendments, and he did. So that evolution that I talk about is one that takes place really from 1868 through the 1870s to 1877. So those two posts are important, those two time sequences. 1868, he joins the Republican Party. As I said, that was like signing a political death warrant. You couldn't really win office in Kentucky. He never had. He'd won an office as Attorney General as a member. He had originally been a Whig. The Whig Party collapsed over slavery. He became a member of, I'm not kidding, the capital O opposition. That was what they called the party. He never became a Democrat. He worked with the Democrats. It was a terrible experience for him. He joined the Republicans. And the other factor, I think, in his evolution was that he met the U.S. attorney for the Republican U.S. attorney, a guy named Benjamin Bristow. Bristow became his law partner. Bristow was also a famous Kentuckian, later the first Solicitor General, then Secretary of the Treasury under Grant. Bristow was more radical than Harlan, and I think that that had a huge influence on him as well. Bristow, as U.S. attorney, prosecuted the Klan in 1867. And he even went so far as, under the 1866 Civil Rights Act, he would remove cases from state court that he thought would not be heard properly and took them into federal court. That's what Bristow was allowed to do, and that's what he was taking advantage of. So unfortunately, I mean, we have letters between Bristow and Harlan. They're mostly about politics. Bristow was the candidate for president in the 1876 election that Hayes became president. And Harlan was his campaign manager at the National Convention in Cincinnati. Before I close off my answer, 1877, when Harlan is appointed by Hayes, some think it was a deal, I don't think it was, but when he's appointed by Hayes to the Supreme Court, he was under attack by the Republican Party from the North because he wasn't a good enough Republican. What was Hayes doing appointing this Southern Republican, somebody who had been a Republican for only 9 years, to the Supreme Court? Couldn't he do better than that? And Harlan took the extraordinary step of writing an 18-page handwritten letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee defending himself, in which he said, yes, I was pro-slavery, I was wrong. Yes, I opposed those civil rights amendments, I was wrong. Yes, I am a good Republican, here's what I've done since. I don't know that his nomination was in trouble. I rather suspect that it was not. It was not an era where there were hearings. There were no public hearings at that era. There weren't public hearings about Supreme Court nominees until the first one was 1915, and that was a rarity. It became a practice in the 1950s. So we don't have a lot of documentary evidence, but one of the amazing things that Harlan did after he became justice was in 1883, when he was writing his dissent, he wanted to understand the legislative history of the 14th Amendment better. So he wrote a letter to George Edmunds, who was the head of the Judiciary Committee, who had been involved in the writing of the 14th Amendment. And he met with him privately to talk about the legislative history. Now, can you imagine if the newspapers reported that a justice, let's say it's Justice Kavanaugh or Justice Kagan, had met privately with the head of the Judiciary Committee to talk about some past legislation. What a scandal. Not in that era.
Well, you mentioned that that there weren't hearings, but still it seemed, was it extraordinary? I mean, we're so used to confirmation hearings in which the candidate for a seat on the Supreme Court evades every question, where you might say how you stand on something, and what you've described as a nominee who's saying pretty clearly a position on matters of civil rights. Was that an extraordinary sort of communication that you know of? Or
I think it was, and I think it was because Harlan, I mean, there were many Supreme Court justices who had a background in politics in that era. You remember in this era, you did not need to go to law school to be a lawyer. You had to read the law and you had to pass the bar exam, but you didn't have to actually go to law school. Many did, some didn't. But you know, the Supreme Court in this era, it was not the most plum job in the world. They did not have a court of appeals until the 1890s. So all the cases that came up to the Supreme Court had to be reviewed. They didn't have to take them all. It was a killer of a job. The cases weren't very interesting. The reason Justice Brown was put on the court was because in that era, there were a lot of admiralty law cases coming from the seas and the rivers, which was the main form of transportation for a lot of people, a lot of goods. And he was expected to write all of the admiralty law cases. So there were many people who were offered a Supreme Court seat and did not take it. The seat that Justice Brown received, that he was selected for, was offered to somebody else beforehand, and he turned it down because he'd rather be a senator than a Supreme Court justice. So Harlan thought being a Supreme Court justice, though, was the greatest job in the world. He could not imagine a better job. Well, if you're from Kentucky and you've run for governor twice and you've lost, what are you going to do? You look toward Washington as a possible place. You can't go there as a senator, probably. You can't go there as a congressman. So the Supreme Court seems like a pretty good job for somebody with Harlan's ambitions.
Question, when Justice Harlan wrote that dissent and in the years that followed, what was the press reaction? Was he hounded for his now famous dissents?
Not at all. So interesting. I sort of hinted at this, but I didn't go into it. When the Plessy decision was released, it wasn't front page news in most newspapers. Of course, the front page wasn't always the front page then either. It had a lot of advertisements on it. In some stories, it was the third case that was covered. Two other cases that day received more attention. Now, why was this? In the white press, which is what we're talking about here, the decision was expected, and it was therefore ho-hum news. In the black press, it was a major case. My newspaper, the Washington Post, covered the oral arguments in April of 1896 by allowing some reporter to write a piece for the Capital Chat column. There was no other story on the oral argument. And they were more taken by the fact that Albion Turget, the lawyer for Plessy, was there, because Turget was not a civil rights lawyer. He was best known as a best-selling novelist and newspaper columnist. His column in the Chicago Inter-Ocean was widely read in the South in Black neighborhoods. But he had written a couple of novels that were bestsellers in the 1880s. They were called A Fool's Errand by One of the Fools, about his time in North Carolina during Reconstruction. And the other one was called Bricks Without Straw. In other words, building a house for the people of color without any glue to hold it together, the metaphor. Well, the Capital Chat columnist wrote that the author of A Fool's Errand is here on another fool's errand. He's arguing the Plessy case, which everybody knows how it will come out. And it didn't even have any facts about what Turget had argued. Only because I have seen the notes from Turget's argument do we know what he might have said to the court. Of course, there's no recording of it. So when the decision came out, Harlan's dissent, unlike his dissent in the civil rights cases, was hardly covered. It wasn't covered until really Brown. After the Brown decision, the New York Times headline in 1954, I'm talking about, their headline after commenting on, their editorial commenting on the decision had the following headline, Justice Harlan for the majority. So people probably didn't understand what that meant, but it drew a lot of attention to Justice Harlan in the 1950s, and that's when a lot of scholarship about Harlan began. In the years afterwards, Harlan was very much celebrated for his war heroism, or being, he wasn't a hero exactly, but for his war service. When at that gala dinner that I talked about, Roosevelt's speech was all about Harlan joining the Union Army in Kentucky and raising his own regiment. When he died in 1911, the headline was Harlan, Union soldier, Union officer, and it went on about his Union service. So he was held in pretty high esteem. He apparently wasn't an easy guy to know, but I don't think he got hounded at all because it was sort of, well, that's just Justice Harlan. We know where he stands.
I'm going to be fairly literal in reading this question from Bob Wallace, one of my colleagues at NKU, and Dr. Wallace is working on a book on Frederick Douglass's time in Cincinnati. So his question is can you comment on the role of Cincinnatian Alphonso Taft, the Attorney General to President Grant in 1876, in challenging the Klan and other murderous groups in the South before the negotiations over the 1876 election resulted in the end of Reconstruction?
Well, the answer is no, because I don't know much of anything about that. I'm sure that Mr. Wallace has read a lot of the other books on this subject, including the somewhat controversial Ron Chernow biography of Grant. I say somewhat controversial, not because there's anything controversial about it, but because it's a very positive view of Grant, and some people don't have a positive view of Grant. I will say, though, about Reconstruction ending, Reconstruction had started to fade before 1876. And I don't agree with the shorthand about the 1876 election that says that there was a deal to withdraw federal troops in return for Hayes becoming president. It was much more complicated than that. There were 3 southern states in which the states had sent 2 different electors, 2 different sets of electors to Washington, and requiring the Senate to choose between them or among them. There was also the state of Oregon, which was also in dispute. The South was so much in turmoil that you could have competing groups both claiming that they had won the election. So this wasn't like this election where we had the national election in dispute. This was 3 different state elections that were in dispute. And so they appointed a commission. The commission, some thought it was unconstitutional, had 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 5 Supreme Court justices. What were the Supreme Court justices doing in the legislation deciding an election? But it came down to Justice Bradley. Certainly there was pressure for the Republicans to win, but I think it's a very complicated story. And Hayes, Hayes is often said to be the person who engineered all this, but Hayes in his diary, at least, and I don't know why he would be writing something insincere, said, I want nothing to do with the outcome of the election. It's not for me to decide. It's up to the commission. No one ought to go to court. No one ought to go to court or to war over an election. Interesting to have that echo in 2021.
A question about Justice Harlan's half-brother, Robert. born
Yes.
into slavery? Did their relationship influence Harlan's judicial thinking on race?
It's not clear. For those of you who don't know this, for many years it was thought that Robert Harlan was John Harlan's brother, that Harlan's father had been responsible for the birth of Robert Harlan with one of the Harlan slaves. Subsequent DNA testing shows that that's not the case. They show that Robert Harlan was in fact a Harlan, but not that he was the offspring of John Harlan's father. I don't think it matters terribly much. Robert Harlan was a member of their household. He was given he had his freedom as a young man. He went off and made a lot of money, settled in Cincinnati. He and Harlan were in touch for much of their lives. Their correspondence is beyond friendly. It's familiar and intimate. No doubt it mattered, but also no doubt that it wasn't the first thing that mattered. I think the first thing that mattered was Harlan's own experiences with the war, with the subsequent experiences with the Democrats and their insistence on white supremacy, his prosecution of the Klan, his relationship with Bristow. It's all part of the stew that I think creates John Harlan the dissenter.
Steve, we're nearing the end of this, but a couple of things. Turn the page just a little bit. I know as we were preparing for tonight's event, you mentioned the book that you worked with colleagues at the Washington Post on the first impeachment and the follow-up editions that are being made to that. And maybe you could just speak a moment, particularly since our Senator McConnell is a player in that drama and someone you interviewed. And I think you were telling us that what you think about, you know about the impeachment, this is a book that will take you inside a little bit, how people were thinking, including McConnell, some of the key players as that unfolded.
Well, my publisher thanks you, Mark, for that plug. Let's make clear, I am the editor of this book. It's called Trump on Trial. It came out in authors are Post reporters Kevin Sullivan and Mary Jordan, with the help of the entire staff of the Post doing interviewing and providing inside information. I think the great thing about the book is that, I mean, we went far beyond. I don't want to say that it goes behind the scenes because that's a tired cliche, because many of the events that we write about were not private or secret, but we had interviews. I did not have personal interviews with very many people, a few, but we had interviews with all of the major players, either through their aides or directly or by email. And so we can tell the story through their eyes as they saw it. And a lot of the showmanship that was on display on the House floor or the Senate floor, what are they really talking about behind the scenes? And we have certain profiles of certain people, I think, that are quite interesting. Will Hurd, the Republican congressman from Texas, and why he was seen as somebody who might vote for impeachment, the first impeachment, but ends up not doing so, and then making a stirring speech against it on the House floor. What was his thinking? What was his journey? It's somewhat the same way we talk about Harlan. What were the journey of these people who had the weight of the world on their shoulders? There's an amazing scene with Alyssa Slotkin, a Democrat from Michigan, who happens to be at a fundraiser in the National Archives only days before her vote. And she's wandering among the founding documents, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and she's thinking about what she's about to do. I think it's a very heartening story about people, not so heartening about perhaps impeachment as a tool. I think the book somewhat shows the limits of impeachment, as whether impeachment is any longer the tool of accountability that the framers of the Constitution intended it to be. I think that the two impeachments show that there's a limit to how far anybody is willing to go. and that perhaps there have to be other ways to hold people accountable for actions. I mean, Trump was found guilty by a majority, but not a 2/3 majority. I think that's a significant act by a significant statement by the Congress, by the Senate, and those 7 Senate Republicans. Is that enough? Does it deter such behavior in the future? As journalists, we stand by waiting to write about it.
Thank you. I'm going to return to Harlan real quick. We have a question. Were Justices Brown and Harlan frequently on opposite sides while they were in the court together?
They weren't. Another important thing to know about the Supreme Court of the 1890s is that it wasn't divided. When I hear Supreme Court today, I'm sure many of you are like me, hear that they're about to, I think immediately 5-4 until the recent election of Trump's nominees. Now I think 6-3, perhaps 5-4. But in the 1890s, 90% of the court's rulings were unanimous. If you have 90% unanimity, then you're going to have Harlan and Brown on the same side most of the time. When Turget did his head counting, he put Brown in the category of possible for finding in Plessy's favor. He also put some other people there. He was obviously wrong about 4 out of the 5 that he hoped would be on his side, and only Harlan was on his side. But they were on the same side in some dissents as well. I write all about this in Separate. If you want to go, they were quite friendly with each other. I think all the justices were. You sort of have to be when you're spending every week in a conference about cases and you're disagreeing and arguing with each other. But Harlan was the great dissenter in a few cases, but he wasn't the dissenter most of the time. He was most of the time, they were all workhorses for the most part, except for the elderly members of the court. Harlan and Brown wrote more opinions almost than anybody else. And so they were churning, Mark, you and I are both from the newspaper world. A lot of times you're just churning out the copy. Well, they were churning out the rulings because they had a lot of them.
I'm going to close with one more question on one of the things, and you talked a little bit about it, but in the book there's a good deal of time spent on Justice Harlan's moving from one party to the other, and parties that we've long since forgotten, and that sort of period of time where parties came and went, and various philosophies kind of followed one to another. And I think we're now, as an astute political observer of the current scene, as we see the Republican Party discuss its future as the Trump Party or not, could you imagine that sort of political landscape reoccurring in America, of parties, one party dying and another emerging as a dominant party, and the way it was in that era?
Well, thank you for calling me astute. I very rarely get called that. I would say that, the political parties were not really envisioned to be the way that they later turned out to be by the framers of the Constitution. But soon 2 parties emerged, and then there was a third, and then the Republican Party was new in 1854. And finally, by the post-Civil War era, you had essentially Republicans and Democrats. But there was the couple of parties in the early 1900s, the Progressive Party. And then, of course, we have what we have today. I don't understand why the Republican Party doesn't break apart. One of my colleagues has written that it can't break apart because the splinter group would be unable to win. But it seems to me that the Republican Party will go through a soul searching over the next 2 years before the midterm elections. It will have to decide whether it is the party of Trump or whether it is the party of Republican Party principles that it has been for the last 50 years. I think one of the overlooked important moments in political history of the last 50 years is the rise of the presidential primary. In 1967, there were only about a dozen political primaries. Now every state has to have one. What is the result of that? The result of that is the end of the backroom dealing that characterized some of party politics in the 1950s and 60s. And the idea that candidates no longer are put up by the party has lost control of its own of its own nominating process. And so what those candidates do is they run for control of the party. And Trump is kind of the apex of this. So you even see in newspaper articles, it's Trump's party. It's the Trump party, the party of Trump. Well, such an idea was really unthinkable, I think, in the Republican Party that I grew up with in the 1950s and 60s, or the Democratic Party. So when the parties turned over the primaries to their, there's no point in being a member of the Democratic Party or a member of the Republican Party anymore. The parties used to have ward bosses and they used to hand out jobs and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's all kind of gone away. I think that was an important time, and it allowed the rise. And, we all know the story. No one thought Trump would win in at the beginning of 2016, but I didn't think that. I didn't have any idea who would win because the party wasn't in control, and the party just stands on the sidelines and watches. The Democrats are the same. And then once the nominee has been anointed, they all rally behind him or her in 2016. So I think that the Republican Party has to decide what it wants to be, because certainly the party of Trump is not the party of Mitt Romney. It's not even the party of Ronald Reagan.
Well, Steve, thank you very much. I wish I could turn the audio on and let everybody give you our applause, because we greatly appreciate tonight's talk and the insights that you've delivered. And thanks for being with us from are you at a bed and breakfast or a Airbnb? Anyway, a place where the internet connection pretty much held up, which is great.
Well, I thank you very much. Full disclosure here, my daughter has had her first child, our first grandchild, and my wife and I are helping out this week what we're calling grandparents camp, as my daughter goes back to work and is still arranging her childcare. So we're a stopgap measure, just like some of the legislation that the Congress has to pass.
Well, congratulations on that, and thanks for being with us. And audience, please join us again a month from now on March the 16th at 6 p.m. And we will be with Jonathan Cullick, who teaches English at NKU, and Shelley Reuter, who teaches English at the University of Cincinnati. They have collaborated on a book, Mockingbird Grows Up, the iconic book that we all know of To Kill a Mockingbird, of course, was reassessed after Go Set a Watchman came out, and Jonathan and Shelley will evaluate that for us and talk about their scholarship in this book, Mockingbird Grows Up. Thanks for being with us. If you get a chance, go by Newport and have a look at the murals. You can see them in progress. And one day you can be back in with Scott Clark and the team in Newport to see the Southgate Street School, which I think, as we saw tonight, there's a direct connection between the Plessy versus Ferguson case and the legacy of that school. So thanks, everyone. And tell your friends to join us next week, or next month, I should say. It's good to be with you. Good night.